Good afternoon, and welcome back to the continuation of our Wednesdays at the Center series on John Hope Franklin and global anti-racism. Today's talk is titled Black Muslims in the World, the Ideological Eclecticism of Black American Sunni Islam with Dr. Rasul Miller, who is returning to Duke as a beloved alum. Please remember to keep yourself muted and share questions or comments in the chat. And now let us welcome Dr. Youssef Carter, a dear friend from UNC Chapel Hill, who will provide an introduction of Dr. Miller and moderate today's program.
Thank you so much, Julie. It's my pleasure to introduce a beloved friend of mine, Dr. Rasul Miller, who is now an assistant professor of history at the University of California, Irvine. His research interests include Black Muslims, Black Muslim communities in the Atlantic world, Black internationalism, and West African Islamic intellectual history. His current book project, entitled Black Muslim Cosmopolitanism, The Global Character of New York City's Black Muslim Movements, examines the Black internationalist origins of early 20th century Black Sunni Muslim congregations in and around New York City, and the transnational networks they built as they engaged traditions and communities of Muslims on the African continent. Rasul received his PhD in History and Africana Studies from the University of Pennsylvania, and he received his bachelor's degree, as Julie mentioned, from Duke University. So without further ado, let's go ahead and hear from our beloved Dr. Rasul Miller. Oh, I think you might be muted, bro.
Thank you for that. Assalamu alaikum, good morning. Ahlan wa sahlan. Great to be here with you all. Thank you so much for the invite. This is truly indeed, a blessed homecoming. As mentioned, I'm an alum of Duke, and so many of you, who are here today, really were formative in my, intellectual development, social development, moral development. Professor Neil, my good friend Youssef. I think my good friend Suleiman Burnett is in the audience, who's been cranking out books as of late. Really, really great, interesting stuff. So I'm gonna jump into it. And the thing about a homecoming is you always get a little bit more nervous, right, when you're presenting in front of family, right? So I'm gonna try to work through the nerves and whatnot. But I'm really excited to be here. And I'm really looking forward to some feedback from you all. So let me go ahead and share screen and give you all some visuals in this PowerPoint presentation. Okay, we're good? All right, excellent. So the title of my talk today, Black Muslims in the World, the Ideological Eclecticism of Black American Orthodox Islam. This is sort of a snapshot from the book that I'm working on based on my dissertation research that looks at Black Orthodox Muslim communities in and around New York City, starting around about 1928, going up to the 1980s. I use the term Orthodox Muslim. If you look at the flyer, you don't see that term in the flyer. In part, that's because I'm still kind of wrestling with this issue of terminology, right? But just as a quick sort of aside, because I'd love to solicit feedback on this, a lot of really brilliant people kind of pushed back on my use of the term Orthodox. But I'm currently still working through it and still using it, because during the period of time that I'm interested in, folks are really not sort of identifying as Sunni or Shia or anything like that. Really, the lines of community and identity contestation are between folks who are members of communities like the Nation of Islam and the Moorish Science Temple, and folks who often refer to themselves as Orthodox Muslims, right? They're not really, distinguishing between whether they're Shia or Sunni or if they're Sufi. Really, it's about folks who are engaged in kind of Orthodox practice. And really, this terminology is something that, I'm not using it to try to argue for the authenticity or legitimacy of one group or against the authenticity of another group. But even groups like the Nation of Islam, in 1965, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad publishes sort of the go-to text on the nation, Message to the Black Man, where he himself talks about Orthodox Muslims and how he's not one of them, right? And critiques what he sees as Orthodox Muslims. And so folks who are part of the communities that I'm studying, I'm focusing on, they often sort of don that title, in response to the Honorable Elijah Muhammad's critique, and sort of, take on that banner and say, yes, we're Orthodox. So that's a little bit on why I'm using that term. So I'd love to hear people's thoughts on that. But in any case, what I'm going to be talking about today is sort of a snapshot from a chapter in the book that looks at, that focuses on a community founded by these two people, Sheikh Daoud Ahmed Faisal and Mother Khadijah Faisal, the founders of a community in Brooklyn called the Islamic Mission of America. Still exists today. It's been renamed Masjid Daoud, even though the community who worships there today looks very different than the community that worshiped there during their lifetimes. They established the community in 1939. Sheikh Daoud and Mother Khadijah passed away in the 1980s and 90s. So I'm gonna leave that image up there for a bit and kind of just, frame my comments for today a little bit. So, one of the reasons why I wanted to focus on the work of Sheikh Daoud and Mother Khadijah is because it really highlights some of the gaps in the literature on Islam in America. Sheikh Daoud and Mother Khadijah are mentioned in a host of works on Islam in America, but there's really no substantive study of their life and their work. And as a result, there are a lot of things that are missed. There are times they're sort of mischaracterized. And part of that has to do with the fact that they're very sort of intellectually eclectic, right? So you kind of can't put them in a box. Folks have tried to depict them as, sort of members of the Moorish Science Temple, as immigrant Muslims from the Arab world, as, kind of reformist Islamist Muslims. And all of this just has to do with the fact that you can't really neatly put them in a box because they're engaging a lot of different intellectual currents from the Muslim world and from their local context. And really the way that I was able to sort of, kind of flesh out their history, their thinking, their work was by, one, looking at an early period of their life that's often neglected, where they're in Harlem, right? Sheikh Daoud actually comes to New York City as a young man at the age of 21 years old, around 1912. And his wife, Mother Khadijah, comes from Bermuda. Sheikh Daoud comes from Grenada. His wife migrates from Bermuda not long after. So they are part of this rich cultural community in Harlem during the Harlem Renaissance, during the rise of the Garvey movement. And this really impacts their thinking, right? They're both artists. Sheikh Daoud is an instrumentalist. He plays violin. Mother Khadijah is a vocalist. They're engaged in the production of African-centered art and things of this nature. But this part of their life really isn't talked about or discussed in much of the literature. In 1939, they moved to Brooklyn and they become the founders of this thriving Islamic community, which is for a long time sort of the most visible Muslim mosque in New York City. And during that time, they're spending time with dignitaries from majority Muslim countries. They're working with the UN, and they're really going about the business of sort of building a Muslim community, building Islam in New York City. And so their writings, or Sheikh Daoud's writings rather, reflect a certain kind of tenor as a result of that. And so what I did is I was able to, through looking at newspaper articles from local publications like the Amsterdam News in Harlem in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, and also looking at oral histories, right? Interviewing folks from the community, I was able to piece together some more things about their life and their work. And I want to just take a moment to mention a dear, beloved friend, mentor, uncle by the name of Hajj Dawood Haroun, who passed away back in 2017. A really, really beloved friend who I got to know right there in Durham, North Carolina, when he was living there as I was an undergrad at Duke. And he really had an impact on my life and my thinking. But one of the many things that he shared with me was his experiences as a sort of, not only a member of the community, but sort of an adopted son of Sheikh Daoud and Mother Khadijah, and Sheikh Daoud's personal secretary. So he had a leadership role in the community, was able to share a lot with me. So I wanted to actually play a clip from one of the interviews that I did with him, but I was having some trouble getting it, to play correctly on my computer. So I'm not going to be able to do that, but I wanted to at least mention him as an important source for some of the comments I'm going to make today. This is a picture. It's kind of blurry. You probably can't see it that well. But this is a picture of a meeting that Sheikh Daoud and Mother Khadijah hosted at their mosque, which was also their brownstone where they lived in Brooklyn, located in 143 State Street. And you see here a number of folks from different communities. Folks from the Nation of Islam are in attendance at this meeting. Folks from the nearby sort of Arab-led mosque on 72nd Street, One Riverside Drive, the Islamic Cultural Center of New York, which is sort of the precursor to, if you know New York City, the big Islamic Cultural Center that's on 96th Street right now. So he had folks from all these communities at this meeting. This here is Sheikh Daoud. This is Mother Khadijah, sort of holding court. You know, one of the things we're not going to talk about so much today, but that I do talk about in the book, is how she really becomes sort of a model for kind of visible, engaged women's leadership in the Muslim community. A tradition that a lot of the people that I interviewed kind of lamented started to wane during the 1970s and 80s for a lot of reasons. The sort of hypermasculinism of Black organizing during that moment, the increased influence of immigrant folks from Arab world and South Asia. But, you know, that's sort of an important sort of part of the character of the community. And this is Sidi Haj Harun, who I just mentioned. This is another picture of Haj Harun. This is an interview that I did with him in 2016, just a year before he transitioned. Okay, so there's kind of three themes that I want to, you know, briefly kind of discuss to kind of frame my presentation today. Three discourses that Sheikh Daoud and Mother Khadijah really engaged. The first being Pan-Africanism, the second being what is sometimes referred to as Pan-Islam or Pan-Islamism, and the last, Sheikh Daoud's engagement with a kind of non-reformist Islamic tradition marked by his, most notably by his embrace of a North African Sufi order, right? So simultaneously engaging Pan-Africanism, Pan-Islamism, and, you know, African Sufism. So this is a clip, a newspaper clipping from the Amsterdam News in 1936. And it, oh, I didn't want to do that. How do I go back? Here we go. It discusses a play that Sheikh Daoud wrote. Before he changed his name to Daoud Ahmed Faisal, his name was David Ambrose Donald. So you see here reference to a play produced by, written by David A. Donald and Dawood Kamara, right? So Sheikh Daoud established something called the David A. Donald Concert Bureau, which was an institution located on 128th Street in Harlem, which engaged in a number of cultural productions, offered vocal lessons. He wrote plays. He worked with esteemed artists like Marian Anderson. This particular play that he wrote with a man named Dawood Kamara. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about him in a moment. But one of the notable things about this play is the subject of the play is actually the famed West African anti-colonial hero and society builder, Samori Toure, right? Who also in his writings, he discussed the fact that he saw himself as, you know, a descendant of folks who fought alongside Samori Toure in West Africa. And you see here, this is a snapshot from one of Sheikh Dawood's writings published in 1950, where he says, my grandfather, one of Africa's great chiefs, and one of the wealthiest, was a Moor, and so was my father, whose mother was an East Indian born in Mauritania. We are of the Bambara tribe, known as the Rift Night Riders, who fought the French from 1865 until 1890 with Samori Toure. And this kind of sort of origin story was very common among Black American folks. And when I say Black American, I'm speaking broadly, including Afro-Caribbean folks like Sheikh Daoud and Mother Khadijah. When many of these folks would embrace Islam, they would often sort of recast their identities and their histories to connect themselves with this more empowering tradition of folks on the African continent, particularly Muslims on the African continent, right? So this caused a lot of folks to kind of made people like Sheikh Daoud illegible to a lot of people, right? When he's calling himself a Moor and saying he's descended from the Bambara tribe, you find, you know, similar things among other notable, you know, Muslim leaders, Black American Muslim leaders in New York, New Jersey, Chicago, Detroit, who are connecting themselves with traditions. Sometimes people are referring to themselves as being Sudanese, for instance, right? Which leads sort of, you know, uninitiated white observers to say, okay, this person must be an immigrant from the nation of Sudan, right? Whereas when you interview people, you find a more sophisticated kind of idea at play where people are saying, no, I'm not a Negro, right? You know, my history doesn't begin with the history of the enslavement of African people in the Americas, but rather it begins with Balada Sudan, right? The land of the Black folks, right? as referred to in Arabic, to connect themselves to histories of people of African descent on the African continent who happen to be Muslim. So Sheikh Dawu is engaging in this same kind of sort of recasting of his history. This is another newspaper clipping from the Amsterdam News. It talks a little bit more about this figure, Dawoud Kamara, who's an important early influence on Sheikh Dawoud and Mother Khadijah. Dawoud Kamara is actually referred to in this article as Al-Mami Dawoud Kamara. And this article is about the meeting of an organization called the Native African Union, right? Interesting organization of African immigrants in the 1930s, 1920s, and 1930s in New York City who are organizing themselves. One of the founders of this organization, interestingly enough, is none other than Deuce Muhammad Ali, the longtime collaborator and one-time mentor of Marcus Garvey, right? So in this particular article, it discusses a meeting that they held on their 5th anniversary in 1932, and it mentions that Al-Mami Dawoud, again, Dawoud Kamara, who is a West African, Muslim, literate Muslim marabu, perhaps a cleric or certainly a knowledgeable, educated Muslim, with religious education, who comes from Guinea. And it says, Al-Mami Dawoud, attired in the raiment of the French West Africans who made a plea for the study and adoption of Arabic as an international African language, right? So here Dawoud Kamara is, Al-Mami Dawoud Kamara is putting forward a position very similar to that, or anticipating that, of Sheikh Anta Diop years later, who argues that Africa should sort of promote the learning of indigenous languages, but also embrace Arabic as a lingua franca. So this is just to give you a sense of the types of folks that Sheikh Dawoud and Mother Khadijah are spending time with as Muslims in the 1920s and 1930s in Harlem. They also spent a lot of time with a number of Somali immigrants who began to come in the late 1930s, who are involved in the freedom struggle to try to maintain Somali independence in the face of Italian aggression. So these are some of the sort of early Black internationalist or Pan-African influences on Sheikh Dawoud and Mother Khadijah. And again, like I said, one of the reasons why this is missed in a lot of the literature, which is already, a little bit scant about Sheikh Dawoud and Mother Khadijah, is because there's not much investigation about their early life in Harlem, right? The focus is on their lives as, visible Muslim leaders, Sheikh Dawoud being a cleric in Brooklyn from the 1940s and 50s and 60s. Another interesting sort of characteristic of the community that gets missed, that you wouldn't really see unless you engage in really collecting oral histories, which is what I did, is the way in which the community that they build in Brooklyn becomes a space where sort of African themed art is celebrated. Sheikh Dawoud and Mother Khadijah's mosque, located on 143 State Street in Brooklyn, becomes sort of a hub for a number of jazz musicians in the era. And some of the literature that discusses the embrace of Islam among a lot of key figures in the jazz world at the time sort of misses the very real, very significant participation of Black Orthodox Muslims in this jazz space. The presumption is that folks probably come from the Ahmadiyya community or something like that. And what I found in my research is that that's not really entirely true, especially in Brooklyn, right? A lot of folks who are sort of identified as being Ahmadiyya in the literature are actually attending this Black-led Orthodox mosque in Brooklyn. They're sort of key figures in Sheikh Dawoud's community. And we could talk a little bit more about that in the Q&A if people are interested. But this is a picture of a couple of folks I interviewed. This is Mama Rakia Abdurrahman, who passed away just a few years ago. And this is an album cover from an album produced by her husband, Bilal Abdurrahman. And Mama Rakia and Bilal were really sort of cultural ambassadors of Islam in New York City. But part of the way in which they sort of made Islam legible and comfortable to the Black community in New York City was through the arts. Bilal Abdurrahman was a musician, noted jazz musician, who played with folks like John Coltrane, for instance. And one of the things that he did was, him and Mama Rakia, they would put together these cultural shows in places like the New York Public Library, different kind of venues where folks from the community could come and they could learn about Islam, but they could also learn about West African culture, West African art. So this sort of linking of Islam and Africanity. This is their daughter, Sister Zainab, who grew up in the community. She talked to me about how, as a young person in the community, you know, Sheikh Dawu would sort of educate folks about African history, right? Again, things that don't necessarily come out in his only 2 written works, but folks in the community talked about the fact that he would encourage folks to identify as African, right? Not just Negro, right? And encourage folks to understand their sort of, you know, their white neighbors as being European, and to really understand history and identity in that way. This is a picture of another prominent musician from the community. Again, someone who's been written about a little bit, and usually sort of misidentified as being Ahmadiyya, when actually he's a pillar in this Orthodox, Black Orthodox Muslim community. His name was Ahmed Abdul Malik, another really notable figure who, again, onlookers would sometimes assume that he was born in Sudan because he described himself as being Sudanese, right? But again, he began describing himself as Sudanese before Sudan, you know, was established as a nation state, right? So again, appealing to this idea of Sudan as a sort of stand-in for the history of Islam on the African continent in sub-Saharan Africa. Another really notable jazz musician who played with John Coltrane, played with Thelonious Monk, and is really celebrated as a person who sort of was a trailblazer in blending jazz with East African and Arab musical forms. So that's just to give you a sense of kind of this Pan-African element. And I'm really referring to a kind of cultural Pan-Africanism that's at play in Sheikh Dawood and Mother Khadijah's community. The next segment, and I thought I had a heading slide, but I guess I deleted it by mistake. But I want to look at sort of this Sheikh Dawood's engagement with sort of Pan-Islamism, and the place that we really see that come out is in his writings, right? So Sheikh Dawood has 2 books that he writes. He writes one in 1950 and writes another one in 1965. And the one in 1965 really reflects the ways in which his thinking, his life, his work had changed now that he's taken on this role as a visible imam in New York City, really the city's most visible imam. So he's working with the United Nations. He's engaged in a lot of service work to support Muslim immigrant communities, as well as building this community that serves as a kind of cultural and intellectual base for this community of Black American and Afro-Caribbean Muslims and artists. And so there's a couple things that kind of come out in this 1965 book, right? One of the things you see that all of a sudden Sheikh Dawood takes a kind of anti-communist turn, right? Which is not really visible in his work in 1950, in the book that he publishes in 1950. But in 1965, you see he becomes critical of communism. And I think part of that has to do with the fact that now that he's engaging different Muslim countries, he's engaging with Somali Muslims who are battling, contending with, you know, a fascist, ostensibly socialist Italian regime that wants to colonize them. He's building relationships with Muslim heads of state like King Faisal Abdulaziz in Saudi Arabia, and he's contending with the American, state apparatus, right? Which is during his lifetime in Harlem and his transition into an imam in Brooklyn is becoming increasingly hostile to Muslims, to Black activists, and to communists, right? So one of the things that I talk about in the book is how, you know, Sheikh Dawood and other Muslim leaders like himself have to sort of navigate this turn. And so you start to see in the 1950s and really the 1960s, a kind of anti-communist stance. That I think kind of is sort of bound up in his engagement with this kind of Islamic internationalism, which I'm calling here Pan-Islamism. But I just wanted to share a couple of slides from Sheikh Dawood's 1965 publication to give you a sense of how this sort of Pan-Islamism is mobilizing itself. So Sheikh Dawood is working with the UN. He's trying to build solidarity with majority Muslim countries throughout the Muslim world. He has no problem embracing this language that comes out of the sort of Nation of Islam and Moorish Science Temple context of this idea of Asiaticness, right? So he's talking about Afro-Asian solidarity and using Islam really as a basis to cultivate this kind of anti-imperial, anti-colonial consciousness among Black and brown people through Islam. So here you have, he includes in this 1965 publication all of these kind of shout outs to strong Muslim leaders throughout the Muslim world, including the ruler of Jordan, including the president of Algeria, but 3 that I think are really notable is one, his sort of shout outs to President Gamal Abdel Nasser, right? And here we see an example of this. He includes a picture of a mosque that was built in Egypt, which at this time was a part of the United Arab Republic that Gamal Abdel Nasser was trying to build. And Gamal Abdel Nasser sends this picture of this mosque to Sheikh Daoud in their correspondences. So here he is sort of including that in his book and thanking Gamal Abdel Nasser for sending it to him. Here you have another sort of shout out that he has in the book of King Faisal Abdul Aziz. And what's really interesting, I mean, and I'm going to talk a little bit more in a moment about his relationship with King Faisal, but as many of you may know, King Faisal and Gamal Abdel Nasser are, vicious opponents at the time, right? They're trying to get their things together, and they're really, opposing one another. But one of the things that's interesting is he praises King Faisal in a lot of his works and his letters, but yet here he has this quote in the bottom. He says, brothers, there's no master and servant among us. We are not kings. We are not emperors. If they consider monarchy a thing to be decried, we consider it only as an imported title. We are not kings, emperors, or despots, but preachers of the book of God and the Sharia of his prophet. Sallallahu prayers and peace be upon him. So part of what he's doing here is he's really kind of defending King Faisal, right? And sort of subtly trying to challenge folks who are questioning his legitimacy as, the representative of a monarchy in the Muslim world, right? So there's some subtle, interesting things going on. But in any case, he becomes rather close to King Faisal. When King Faisal is Prince Faisal, he travels to America a number of times as the UN representative of Saudi Arabia, and he begins building relationships with Black American Muslims, chief among them Sheikh Daoud, and these relationships continue into the 1960s and 70s, and really with the royal family even into the 1980s. This is the copy of a letter that Sheikh Daoud sends to King Faisal, thanking King Faisal for some financial support. King Faisal sends, on at least one occasion, he sends about $5,000, right? This is in 1965. So that's, kind of significant to Sheikh Daoud Ahmed Faisal. He helps to renovate the mosque. Sheikh Daoud and Mother Khadijah, I should say, really kind of go through a personal, I won't say fortune, but they're doing pretty well because of their work in the arts. Sheikh Daoud also works as a porter on the railroad. They buy some property. They buy the building at 143 State Street and perhaps a couple of other properties, brownstones in New York. And they basically spend all of their finances that they're able to amass in trying to help support the community, trying to help build this Muslim community, and trying to support both these Black American and Afro-Caribbean Muslims in New York City, as well as immigrants who are passing through, some of them students, people in need, things like that. So you see this kind of cultivation of a relationship with Saudi Arabia and a building of solidarity. He sees this potential solidarity with Muslim nations like Saudi Arabia, like Morocco, and some others as a potential source for resources to help empower the Muslim community and the Black community in New York City. And then here you have a similar shout out for the Shah of Iran, right? And he's speaking highly about the Shah of Iran's, sort of social reforms toward the end of his reign, and the things that he's trying to do to promote literacy in Iran, things like that. So part of the reason why I include these snapshots is you see this way in which Sheikh Dawood is positioned to kind of uniquely sort of see the value in what all three of these rulers in the Muslim world who have a contentious relationship between one another could have for Black Muslims and for the growth of Islam writ large in America, right? And this is part of what I mean when I talk about ideological eclecticness, right? And we're going to see this same kind of approach is embraced by Malcolm X, Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz, once he breaks from the nation. And, some of you may be familiar with the work of Adam Getachew, her recent work on world making, where she talks about, people like Kwame Nkrumah, people like Du Bois as being engaged in this kind of anti-colonial world making, where, their kind of political solidarities are really motivated by this notion of trying to stave off Western domination, right? This idea of non-domination, stave off Western domination, colonialism, and imperialism, and the kind of solidarities that allows them to forge. And in a really great review oh, I'm forgetting the author. I meant to write it down, but I forget. But a really great review that another scholar recently wrote. He talks about how even the Shah of Iran can be understood, before the Islamic Revolution of 1979 as being engaged in the same kind of anti-colonial world making. We find that all of these rulers, even somebody like the Shah of Iran, who's considered by many to be a puppet of the West, right, is still interested in amassing a degree of political economic autonomy for the Muslim world and for not only his own nation, but sort of the nations of color, right? Sort of non-Western nations as a block, right? And we can maybe get into that a little bit more in the Q&A. But part of the argument that I'm making in the book is that Sheikh Daoud is someone who's uniquely positioned as a Black American Muslim to kind of see the potential for that solidarity without getting bogged down in some of the intellectual fights and political fights that people are having in the Muslim world. And here we have a picture from an Arab summit that's attended by both Gamal Abdel Nasser and Prince Faisal at the time. I guess King Faisal at the time, as well as a number of other rulers from the Muslim world. Both rulers here pictured also famously attended the Bandung conference. So you see again this kind of this desire to really celebrate these strong rulers from throughout the Muslim world. And lastly, I want to talk about in our sort of final moments, another sort of element of this ideological eclecticism is Sheikh Dawood's embrace of Sufism. And I really wanted to play a quote from my interview with Haj Haroon, but I just wasn't able to get that together today. I always have a little bit of issues with my video stuff, so I have to work that out. But here, Haj Haroon was the person who really shared with me Sheikh Dawood's engagement with Sufism. And it's something that, only a few people in the community knew about. His stance was kind of that Sufism, Islamic traditional spirituality, some people sometimes call it Islamic mysticism, was something that sort of the rank and file community didn't necessarily need to engage in, but it was something that was for sure personally very compelling and very important to his own spiritual journey. He became a muqaddam or representative of Sheikh Ahmed al-Alawi. I'm trying to pin down when exactly that happens. It's rumored by some folks that I spoke with who studied in Morocco that there's a ledger of all of Sheikh Ahmed al-Alawi's representatives around the world, and that Sheikh Dawood's name is on the ledger. If that's the case, that would locate his embrace of this Sufi order to prior to 1934. And let me back up and say Sheikh Ahmed al-Alawi is a Sufi Sheikh of the Alawiya branch of the Shadali Sufi order, right? So one of the stories that Haj Haroon shared with me is that, once he was sitting with Sheikh Dawood, and Sheikh Dawood said, people always ask me, what gives me this authority? What makes me a sheikh? Sheikh this, sheikh that, sheikh what? Where do you get this permission from? And he takes off his kufi, and inside the kufi, he has a pouch, a leather pouch. And he takes out the pouch and he has an ijaza, a scholarly authorization from Sheikh Ahmed al-Alawi himself, right? And he says, this is where I get my authority. And you see him here, and in many of the pictures that you'll find of Sheikh Dawood, he's dressed in the attire that resembles that of Sheikh Ahmed al-Alawi, and people from this Alawiya Darqawi, that's kind of the sub-branch of the Shadali order, similar kind of kufi, the tasbih around his neck, right? Similar kind of jalaba. All of that, right? He had an affinity for this kind of North African expression of Islam, which may have to do with the fact that he comes of age and becomes into consciousness and becomes Muslim at a moment when the Moorish Science Temple is very prominent in Harlem and New York City, when a number of folks who had been associated with the Moorish Science Temple are embracing Orthodox Islam in the 1920s, late 1920s and 1930s, which is the time when Sheikh Dawood sort of cuts his teeth as a representative of Islam in Harlem, right? And, for time's sake, I won't go into too much detail, but, sort of one of the big, I think, implications of his engagement with the Sufi tradition is the fact that in terms of, and even in the community that he built, one of the things that observers shared with me, or members of the community shared with me, is that was a high degree of sort of diversity of practice in the mosque. I don't know if you can hear that. That's my one of my boys in the other room, wilding out. Not sure why, but hopefully, it's not too loud, too distracting. But in any case, in the mosque that Sheikh Dawood and Mother Khadijah built, there was a high degree of diversity of practice. People who followed different madhahib, different schools of thought, people from all over the Muslim world. And Sheikh Dawu didn't impose any one particular expression of Islamic practice on people as being normative. He certainly was engaged in this idea of Islamic orthodoxy, but it was one that sort of harkened back to this notion of what you'll sometimes hear people refer to as the big tent of Ahlul Sunnah, or the diverse, sort of super tradition of Sunni Islam. And one other hallmark of that is the embrace of Sufi orders, right? Sufi tariqas. And he very much embraced that. And even though he seems to have had an affinity for someone like Prince Faisal Abdul Aziz, right, in the state of Saudi Arabia, he never embraces this kind of reformist orientation toward the faith that is sometimes associated with movements like the Wahhabiyya in Saudi Arabia, or the Salafi movement, which come to have far more influence on Black Muslim communities and Muslim communities in America in general in the 1990s and 2000s. And this is, I think this is my last slide. And the reason I wanted to end with this is because this is a famous picture, or a picture of the one meeting that we know of between Sheikh Daoud and Malcolm X. Like I said, we know Sheikh Daoud had met with members of the Nation of Islam, but he was a staunch critic of the Nation of Islam. You can find, exchanges in local Black newspapers between Sheikh Daoud and Honorable Elijah Muhammad, where they're basically going back and forth at one another about, whose Islam is more correct. And, he's very critical of the Nation of Islam from a theological standpoint. But here you see him meeting with Malcolm. This here is a brother by the name of Benjamin Kareem, who's an aide to Malcolm X, who is a sort of, pioneering member of the Muslim community in Philadelphia, who makes the transition from the Nation of Islam to the leadership of Imam Warthi Muhammad. It's another story that for another day. And this is a brother by the name of Hajj Mukhtar, who is another Afro-Caribbean Muslim who's a pillar of the community, who I'm trying to learn a little bit more about. But this, of course, is Sheikh Daoud, and this meeting takes place at the United Nations. Sheikh Daoud, again, was very active in trying to cultivate relationships with Muslim countries and leverage those relationships with the UN to address issues of white supremacy, right? Which is something that, if folks are students of Malcolm X's life, particularly in the year after he leaves or after he gets kicked out of the Nation of Islam, this strategy should sound very familiar to you. Similarly, if you read the literature on Malcolm X and his travels to the Muslim world, you find that he's building a relationship with Saudi Arabia, right, and is obtaining resources from the Saudi Arabian-based Muslim Saudi dynasty-backed Muslim World League, right? These are the folks who give him some support, offer him scholarships for people in his community who want to study, send back a Sudanese sheikh by the name of Sheikh Hassoun to help him to instruct the members of his community in normative Muslim practice. He's also going and spending time with representatives of the government of Gamal Abdel Nasser, right? And is a fan and a promoter or celebrator of Gamal Abdel Nasser's, sort of anti-colonial Pan-African stance. He also is meeting in private with members of the Muslim Brotherhood. When he goes to Nigeria, the famous picture that you may know of Malcolm, where he's wearing a turban in a sort of Nigerian style, and he's sitting, standing next to two Nigerian Muslims, one of them wearing sort of traditional Islamic and African garb. That's the Nigerian representative of Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse, the famed Senegalese Tijani Sufi Sheikh, right? So we find that Malcolm, similar to Sheikh Daoud, has this orientation as a Black Muslim in America that allows him to sort of see the greater need for unity, this kind of anti-colonial stance, this ability to be invested in an expression of Islamic orthodoxy and still remain intellectually and ideologically eclectic, right? Oftentimes when we talk about Malcolm, people want to try to pin Malcolm down, right? Was he a socialist, or was he a Sunni in the sort of lane of a Saudi Arabian kind of reformist Islam? Was he somebody who would have been down with the Muslim Brotherhood? Would he have been a supporter of Khomeini's revolution in Iran? Would he have been an African Sufi because he was such a Pan-African? And I think, unfortunately, obviously, we didn't have as much time to see how Malcolm would have flowered, but I think it's very possible and very probable that we would have seen him, similar to Sheikh Daoud, find a way to be all those things at once, right? And I'm not trying to make the argument in the book that Malcolm is kind of a direct student of Sheikh Daoud or takes direct inspiration from Sheikh Daoud or anything like that. But Malcolm is very much aware of these Black American Muslims in New York City who are part of Sheikh Dawood's community. He makes references to, you know, the ways in which certain Black American Muslims are able to don the aesthetic of Arab and African Islam to be able to subvert white supremacy and subvert segregation. We also know that he spends time, or he goes to visit an African restaurant or more of a tea house and concert hall called the African Quarters, which I neglected to mention was actually established by Mama Rakia and Bilal Abdurrahman, who I showed in the previous slide. So this is a part of the context that Malcolm is a part of as he's learning about Islam and serving as the minister of the Nation of Islam in Mosque number 7 in Harlem, and ultimately, you know, sort of building his own sort of Islamic and intellectual and political life in the 9 months or so after he breaks from the Nation of Islam, right? So, you know, certainly it seems that it's possible that this community orientation is one that Malcolm derives some inspiration from. But even if that, you know, even if the inspiration wasn't great, it's interesting that he arrives at a very similar kind of intellectual and political orientation vis-a-vis Islam. So I'll stop there, right? And, you know, I'm really looking forward to questions and comments. And, you know, this is still very much a work in progress, right? This is my first book, right? So please, all the constructive feedback that you would, you know, be willing to offer, I really welcome and solicit. And, you know, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rasul Miller. It's always a pleasure to listen and learn from you. There are so many thoughts swirling around in my head, obviously, as I'm sure the same for the rest of the people who have had the fortune to listen to what you presented today. First and foremost, I just want to say again, thank you for all of what you shared. Especially thank you for shouting out our beloved Hajj Daoud Haroun. As you were talking, I had to run and go get this garment that used to belong to him. So his spirit sits with us, alhamdulillah. I was fortunate to be able to wear it when I went on Umrah and walked through the streets of Medina and carried this with me, alhamdulillah. I wanted to start with, so also shout out to Sister Mujiba Haroun, his beloved better half, alhamdulillah. I wanted to start out.
I don't mean to cut you off, but I missed not to add on to that and say, you know, Sister Mujiba, may Allah preserve her, shower her blessings. She's been kind enough to share with me some of Hajj Haroun's writings and things from his archive. And so this has been, you know, just a wealth of information for me in writing this book. So I just wanted to add on and lift up her name along with you.
Indeed. And I hope that his sort of memory and interventions and contributions will have an important part in the writing of your book, inshallah. I wanted to start with the question of orthodoxy, right? We talked a little bit about this, and even of course Christian Peterson, shout out to Christian, talked a little bit about this in the chat. So simple question, what do we gain or lose from our usage of the term, right? So there's a way in which kind of religious studies space, academic study of religion, we sort of resist using this sort of term orthodoxy because of the sort of claims that it makes about the very people who we endeavor to study. But also at the same time, as you suggest, and I think you are right to do so, there's a manner in which we have to be careful not to override the manner in which people use the term themselves, right? In terms of thinking about how they located their identities, how they located their practice, how they located their position, I guess you could say, in a kind of a universe of Islamic peoples and movements, et cetera. So if you could talk a little bit about that, that would be great.
Sure, sure. And thank you, Christian, for that. Yeah, so this is something, like I said, I've been struggling with. And at one time I abandoned the term. Folks were saying, people that I really respect and really brilliant people who gave me a lot to think about were like, well, maybe you want to say Sunni, but, folks on the ground aren't calling themselves Sunni.
Right.
So to speak to the question more directly of sort of what does it do? I think this term orthodoxy, part of the reason why I'm kind of deciding at the moment to use this term is I think a part of what makes the Muslims that I'm studying, right? This is not a book about the Nation of Islam. I talk about the Nation of Islam. I certainly think these folks are in conversation with the Nation of Islam. And by no means do I mean to diminish the importance of the Nation of Islam in the establishing of Islam in America, writ large, black, white, or whoever, right? But I found that communities that were not a part of groups like the Nation of Islam and the Moorish Science Symbol were left out of the literature often, right? There's a dearth of literature on them. And at least in New York, and I suspect other cities that have that kind of global character that New York had, prior to the 1950s, Black Orthodox Islam is far more, popular among Black American folks on the ground, right? The Nation of Islam doesn't really explode on a national level. I just said explode and had an explosion. That's weird. I don't know. Is the visual okay for you all?
Yeah, it might be. Maybe there's something on the camera.
Okay, yeah, that was it. Sorry, thank you. Looks a lot better now. Yes, I need to clean that camera. But yeah, it's really not until Malcolm comes to Harlem as the minister of Mosque number 7 in 1954 that the nation begins to overtake, so to speak, Black Orthodox Islam as the primary expression of Islam, most visible, most popular expression of Islam on the ground in New York City, right? So I wanted to kind of highlight that, but I also wanted to center the conversation that's being had between the nation and these folks that I'm calling Orthodox. And it is a conversation. They're influencing each other, no doubt. They're responding to each other. Sometimes the relationship between the two is quite contentious, sometimes not so much, right? But what I think really distinguishes, Black Orthodox Muslim communities is not their desire to see themselves as Sunni, because, we talk about someone like Hajrun, who's a product of this experience in this community. He spends time in Iran, Sunnism, Shiism, Sufism, all of it is a part of his peer view, right? And that's not odd, right? It seems odd to a lot of us who kind of have inherited these traditional fault lines of community membership, right? But it's not on the ground. If you start to look at, one person who I didn't mention today, but I talk about in the book is an Egyptian scholar by the name of Sheikh Suleiman Dunya. May Allah have mercy on him. Who's a huge scholar in Egypt. He's the head of the departments of philosophy and theology at Azhar University. But toward the end of his life, he comes to America and he becomes, he really dedicates himself to teaching and empowering the burgeoning working class Black and brown Muslim communities in New York and in New Jersey, right? Much to the chagrin of groups like the Muslim World League, who sponsor him really to be kind of their representative. But in any case, in some of his writings, he talks about, this kind of broad doctrinal, I don't want to say tolerance, right? But this idea of an engagement with Islam that allows for a degree of diversity within the scope of what we call orthodoxy, right? So folks from these communities are engaging in that, right? They're engaging in those discourses. They're taking those discourses up. But ultimately, I think the other thing that really characterizes them is their desire to be a part of a global conversation in a global community. I really think the fault lines have something to do with, and we've talked about this a little bit, in a previous session, but a kind of emphasis on internationalism for the folks who take up Islamic orthodoxy, and an emphasis on Black nationalism, a kind of localized Black nationalism to empower, politically, economically empower Black communities in America, right? And I think that's really what the nation comes to emphasize. And so in some ways, I think this engagement in a kind of a notion of global Islamic orthodoxy, right? It is something that I think both animates the theological and doctrinal orientation of the folks that I'm studying, right? And, you know, the theological orientation they take pushes them further in that direction, if that makes sense, right? Yeah. So, you know, to just say Sunni, I don't think it will capture that, right? I haven't found a term, you know, that captures it. Yeah. Orthodoxy kind of does if you unpack it in a way. And orthodoxy is the term that folks on the ground are using to distinguish between these folks and folks in the nation. So that's what I'm using now. But I'd love some suggestions of other ways that I
mean, there's also the way in which, like, the question of orthodoxy itself, as you mentioned, lacks a kind of fixity in the context that we're talking about, right? So it's not merely theological. It goes beyond. There's also a kind of a cultural orthodoxy that, in terms of thinking about a kind of thinking of Islam as, you know, as in my work, I'm trying to sort of think about the deployment of Islam in a Black Atlantic context as a decolonial theological intervention. Right. So what would it mean for someone to ascribe to all of the so-called, to envision themselves as part of the Ahl Sunnah, but at the same time ascribe to a kind of a white supremacist vision of something, right? We could sort of think about this, particularly in a kind of a Black Islamic context, as beyond the realm of a kind of orthodox stance. Right. In a way, I'm just thinking out loud here. I wanted to move on to really quickly this question of internationalism. You use this term eclectic internationalism, and as I understand it, your sort of deployment of the term is not to sort of describe this sort of self-fashioning as a sort of a random pastiche or a melange of elements, but rather a kind of a calculated dialogue, a calculated fusion of local and international elements. And what I love about your work is to highlight an understudied focus on the fact that there's a long history. I was literally talking to Bilal last night on the phone about this long history of global dialogue that we see in the history of Black American or rather American, you know, Muslim history, right? An aspect of which sort of Black Americans have contributed to, obviously, in terms of thinking about travel, ideology, political vision, ways of knowing, transmissions of knowledge. As you also talk about, there's a kind of way in which Sheikh Daoud and his sort of vision is very much resonant with that of the late Imam W.D. Muhammad, who you mentioned, as well as Sheikh Hassan Sise, right? Whose idea of a kind of a global Black Muslimness involves a kind of a Pan-Africanist tinge, but also a Pan-Islamist vision of self and ummah, right? That, in my mind, I think, and this is where the question comes in, it troubles this question of a dichotomous understanding of Black and immigrant American public sphere. So if you could talk a little bit about that. I mean, we touched on it a little bit, but if we,
No, thank you for that. It's an excellent question. And, you know, it really speaks, I mean, this is, you know, they say, you know, you should be in the habit of, you know, when you get your first job, or talking about yourself as a scholar, talking about your book, right? But I'm gonna step back and talk about the dissertation, right? You know, one of the things that I'm sort of thinking through as I try to turn, you know, this dissertation research into a book is how much scaffolding do I do? How much do I kind of let people see, you know, kind of the intellectual journey that I've come to try to write this thing? And one of the things that, you know, we have to contend with as folks who are writing about Islam in America in general, but especially writing about Black folks who are Muslim in America, is the work of Dr. Sherman Jackson, right? Awesome scholar, you know, an inspiration for a lot of us that have taken this sort of academic journey as people who are practicing the faith, right? Unapologetically and kind of, you know, not in the closet. But, you know, in his work, 2005 work, Islam and the Black American, I think he really does a lot to kind of crystallize this idea of a dichotomous relationship between orthodoxy and heterodoxy, one, right? But also this idea of Black American Islam versus immigrant Islam. Right. And I think there's some value in that. He speaks to some of the real tensions that folks are having on the ground. But I think it's also kind of as with any, major intellectual intervention, right? Because nothing's perfect, right? Well, something's perfect, but none of the stuff we're creating is perfect, right? It kind of bogs us down a little bit, because what do you do with a community? I mean, these communities that I'm writing about, they're not indigenous, quote, even that term is kind of problem, but they're not African American Muslim communities. Sheikh Dawoud is very international in his thinking.
Right.
He and his wife are kind of the mother and father of not only Black Islam in America, vis-a-vis groups like the Darul Islam movement that come out of Sheikh Dawoud's community, more or less, right? Or founded by people who had been members of his community. But even the Arab Muslim community in Brooklyn, right? Owes a huge debt to Sheikh Dawoud. He's really the imam of the community that allows them to get their footing, right? So I think you're absolutely right. There's this idea that, part of what I'm really responding against in this whole book is this idea that if we want to think about Islam in America, we can think about Black folks who are Black nationalists, and we can think about this kind of Sunni universalism, right? That other folks are sort of speaking to. And, that just doesn't work when you look at some of these early communities. And I think really what they're engaged in is a kind of, a perspective that is at once internationalist, Black internationalist or Pan-African, and also universalist, in as much as people are engaged in this kind of normative, perspective of Islam. And I think you mentioned Sheikh Hassan Sisi, his grandfather, Sheikh Ibrahim Yas, right? I think these are folks who really articulate a vision that is more in line with what I'm reading as sort of the origin story of Islam in 20th century America, right? It's this desire to be part of a global community, and at the same time speak to the specific needs of a Black community in the Atlantic world dealing with racial capitalism and all of its evils and ills, right? And so the way I kind of frame the book is I start with, talking about how, when Blyden goes to West Africa and spends time with Tijanis, right, who fought in what I would cast as, in many ways, an anti-colonial movement helmed by Sheikh Umar al-Futi, or at least a movement to stave off the political economic destruction that came from the encounter with the West, right? And how this kind of sets the seeds for the intellectual tradition of people like Dus Muhammad Ali and Garvey, and these are the folks who are influencing Sheikh Dawoud, right, and others, right? And I end it with the discussion of how in New York City by the 1970s and 80s, you have a contingent of folks who come out of these communities that I talk about throughout the book, who meet Sheikh Hassan Sisi and embrace the Tijani order, embrace this kind of Black internationalist Orthodox Islam, and start to live transnationally in West Africa. So I know that opens up a whole other can of worms that we don't have time to really get into. But I guess I'm saying that to say, what you're bringing about is exactly the kind of, the kind of discursive kind of engagements that I'm trying to bring out and analyze in the book.
All right. So let's ask this question from Bruce Lawrence, and we're going to go until Julie cuts us off. So this comes by way of Julie from Bruce Lawrence. So his first question is about gender, and this is also in the chat if you want to find it. The first question seems to be about gender. And so his question is, what was the distinctive role of Mother Khadijah, of Khadijah, in the Islamic mission? And how did she not only complement, but also expand the impact of Sheikh Dawoud? And his second question is about networks. What was the role of networks, right? Communications via travel, letters, phone calls, or Western unions, all in the pre-internet era. How did these now outdated instruments of info exchange or information exchange impact the Islamic mission from 1940 until the death of Sheikh Dawoud in 1980?
Right. And thank you for squeezing that in, because, Bruce Lawrence is another person that I have to, I owe a debt of gratitude that I won't talk about too much, because then I won't have time to answer the question, right? But I'll just say that along with Hajarun, Bruce Lawrence is someone who, I studied with while at Duke, who left an indelible mark on my thinking, and I'm really elated that he's here. And I didn't see his name, but some kind of way he got a message in, right? Because he's the master of networks, right? So I'm appreciative of that, and I really hope that I can, be in communication with you, Professor Lawrence, really soon. in any case, to the question, to the awesome question. So first off, the role of gender. So this is something that I'm also thinking through in writing this book, because oftentimes when people, Professor Lawrence,
There he goes. There he
good
is.
to see your face.
To see you.
Wow, this makes my day. So to try to offer an answer to you know, your really important question, Professor Lawrence. So a lot of times when people write, you know, works about Black religion, or, you know, unfortunately, often in a lot of social sciences, when we write about gender, we sometimes people cordon it off to like a section, right? Like, this is my section where I'm going to talk about gender, or not even about gender, talk about women, right? And I didn't want to do that. I wanted to kind of, you know, let gender be something that animates the discussion throughout the text, right? Having said that, one of the things I'm finding is that I am seeing that I have to do a better job of kind of highlighting that I'm doing that, right? Because there are a lot of ways in which these early communities before the 1970s really do embody a gender dynamic that I think, you know, most students of Islam in America would be surprised by. Even if you go back to that image I showed you of the meeting at Sheikh Daoud and Mother Khadijah's house, right? You see, you know, a number of sisters there. They're prominent. Some are covered, some are not, right? This was very much just sort of normative at the time. What we find is that Mother Khadijah, she occupied a visible role as the secretary treasurer of the community, as one of the members of the board. There was a sort of auxiliary women's association that she was the head of. And she really did a lot to, one, educate Muslim women, right? And also sort of emulate a style of leadership that a number of the Black Muslim women that I interviewed from the 1960s and 70s attempted to really follow, right? Where they were starting their own organizations. They were organizing events in the community. They were, you know, given a degree of authority and deference, right? Even if they didn't have the title imam, right? That I think is unfortunately kind of unexpected, right? In a Muslim community like this. And one of the things that I discuss in the book is that begins to change in the 1970s for some of the reasons that I mentioned, the hypermasculinism of Black organizing at the moment, that even Muslim and non-Muslim folks that I interviewed have kind of, you know, sort of ruminated on as one of the places where folks kind of went wrong, right? As well as the increased influence of Muslims from the Arab world and from South Asia. And I don't say that to vilify Arabs or South Asians, but it's a very different kind of social context with regard to how spaces are gendered and women's role in sort of public leadership, right? In religious communities, right? So I think those are the things that kind of change it. But another thing that Mother Khadijah does, I mean, and I think this really kind of encapsulates some of what I'm trying to get at. Once Sheikh Dawood passes away, the community of folks that had been worshiping at 143 State Street and even just visiting 143 State Street see Mother Khadijah as, you know, the person who's in charge, right? She does a lot to kind of help run the community while Sheikh Dawood is alive. Sheikh Dawood, to his credit, always mentions her, right? They really are kind of a dynamic duo. It's not like Sheikh Dawood is the imam and Mother Khadijah is just his kind of aide, right? They're really kind of like a 1-2 punch. But because Mother Khadijah isn't writing in the same way and occupying that kind of visible role as the cleric, right? It kind of gets lost unless you talk to people on the ground. So if I just wrote this history with no oral history, I would miss all of that, right? But when you look at an oral history and you see the kind of informal kinds of leadership that Mother Khadijah occupies, that other women in the community like Mama Rakia, who I mentioned, occupy, you start to see, oh, this is a community where, you know, you're expected to see women as being able to occupy these positions of authority and leadership. Once Sheikh Dawood passes away, Mother Khadijah is at the helm, and one of the young immigrant Muslims, a brother by the name of Omar, I believe from Indonesia, kind of gets drafted to be the imam because he's somebody that Sheikh Dawood and Mother Khadijah have a close relationship with. But, and this is a lot, so I'm going to try to say it as succinctly as I can, the community was no longer populated by Black American worshipers the same way it had been in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. That has to do with a lot of different dynamics. This is the emergence of the Daud al-Islam movement, in the 1960s, which attracts a lot of the young energy of folks who would have been worshiping at Sheikh Dawoud's community. And, you know, I'm not blaming anybody for that. It would be a long discussion to talk about the various dynamics. Part of that is because Sheikh Dawoud at this point is in his 80s, right? He's an elder, right? From a different era. And so there's some generational clashes that happen. And so the majority of the folks who are worshiping at Sheikh Dawoud's mosque at that point, Sheikh Dawoud and Mother Khadijah's mosque, are Yemeni immigrant Muslims, right? Newer immigrants whose ability to establish themselves in America is supported by the community that Sheikh Dawoud and Mother Khadijah built. They open the doors and create all of these different mechanisms to support those folks, right? But some of them who don't know that history, a couple of the elders do, right? And this is one of the reasons why they ultimately named the mosque Masjid Dawoud. Right. But people who don't know that history, don't understand the social context, begin to try to assert their authority on the community. One of the things they try to do is force a marriage between Mother Khadijah, because Mother Khadijah is living on the top floor of the brownstone that her and her husband bought, right? And gifted for the operation of a mosque. She's living on the top floor, and then the bottom floor is the musalla, right? And the imam has a space where he lives on a different floor, right? And this new Yemeni immigrant community comes and says, well, this is unacceptable, to their social mores, that a woman and a man could live in the same building, even on a different floor. In order for this to happen, y'all have to get married, or Mother Khadijah has to just go find somewhere else to go, right? And this is the kind of, really tragic exchanges that come about as a result of that older history of engaged, visible women's leadership in a more integrated, not saying that there's no kind of notions of a level of gender separation sometimes, right? But this idea of an extreme kind of gender separation being imposed on a community is part of what erodes that, right? So I don't know if that only, I think, kind of hints at an answer to the question, but that I think is something that's important to mention. And just, Mother Khadijah, even in the midst of that, is still, carrying forward the work, is the visible representative of the community, is keeping the relationships with different heads of state and dignitaries and doing things like that. She's giving, she's speaking, she's doing things like this. So that's just a snapshot of some of what she does. To the second question, I'll try to answer this as briefly as I can.
30 seconds.
30 seconds. 30 seconds. So networks, right? 30 seconds. So a big part of what enables, or one of the ways in which the internationalism of these early Black Muslim communities, like Sheikh Dawoud and Mother Khadijah's, like the community founded by Professor Muhammad Ezzuddin, that I didn't mention here, but that, is sort of a precursor to Sheikh Dawood's movement, or they're really kind of neck and neck, but Professor Muhammad Ezzuddin is an elder, so he's kind of more of a mentor, right? And communities that emerge in the wake, like the Daoud al-Islam movement, like the Mosque of Islamic Brotherhood, which I talk about, at length in another chapter. And of course, the emergence of, Black American Sufi communities, chief amongst them, the Tijani community, also the Burhaniya community, Black American folks who are connected to the Burhani order of Sudan, right? One of the things that animates all of this is travel. So in the early days, what you have is someone like Professor Muhammad Ezzuddin, right, in the late 1920s, who's able to travel to Turkey, then travel to Egypt, and spends 5 years in Egypt studying Islam, right? He's able to facilitate an engagement with a kind of normative Islamic tradition and literacy through his travel, right? Someone like Sheikh Dawoud, he's able to interact with East and West African immigrants, right? And so he's a part of now this extended network that connects him to West Africa and East Africa and Morocco. Another important figure in the community is a young man named Mohammed Khabaj, who's a Moroccan immigrant who Sheikh Dawoud kind of, enlists to be the imam to help with everyday affairs, right? As he's out being sort of the representative of Islam in New York City. What happens by the 1970s, though, is folks are able to travel a little bit more, right? Folks are becoming more literate. And as a result, there's less of a sort of engagement with the tradition and with global Muslim networks through sort of individuals who are able to travel, and through the mobilization of histories of Islam on the African continent. And what happens in the 70s and 80s is that gives way to real communal engagement, where folks are actually spending, significant time overseas, They're living transnationally. Mama Rakia and Bilal Abdul Rahman, for instance, who I mentioned, they spend time in West Africa as sort of cultural ambassadors. So increased travel sort of strengthens these networks. And that ultimately is how, these communities are able to, it kind of changes the character of the communities, makes them even more international, sort of bolsters the internationalism. Last thing I'll say is one of the other things that does, though, is it allows, I'm sorry, Julie,
no,
it allows for kind of the emergence of some competing geographies.
Mm-hmm.
So whereas you have the folks that I'm focusing on in this book, who are sort of the inheritors of this tradition that I lay out, right? By the 70s and 80s, they're going to Senegal, they're going to Sudan,
mm-hmm.
right? To lesser numbers, they're going to Ghana, right? And they're spending time there and really living this Black internationalist Islam, if I can call it that. Mm-hmm. By the 80s and the 90s, other folks, children of the same tradition, because Sheikh Daoud is a Pan-African and a Pan-Islamist, right? Other folks are choosing to go to the Gulf. They're going to the University of Medina. They're spending time in Saudi Arabia, right? Now we find more and more people going to places like UAE and Dubai. Yep. And what that causes on the ground is a kind of, maybe it's a friction. I don't know. We're seeing it. I know you're seeing it along with me, right? We're seeing it on the ground where you have these kind of competing geographies, based on these networks that begin to be constructed in the 1940s and 50s and 60s in places like New York and Philadelphia, as people are building community with immigrants, as people are traveling, and as Professor Lawrence says, people are starting to get resources from folks in the Muslim world and send resources, right? Sending, if you want to call them remittances, right? If a Black American can send a remittance to Senegal, then I guess we're doing remittances, right? All of this kind of fosters now a couple of different geographies among Black American Muslim communities on the ground. And I think part of what we're seeing play out, and part of what I wanted to historicize is historicize that debate, the competing geographies that are created by this shared history, and that then motivates these theological and doctrinal debates that folks are having on the ground, right? But I don't think we can really understand those debates unless we ground them in these histories by which people are plugging into these different expressions of Islam from around the globe. I hope that makes a little bit of sense.
It makes a whole lot of sense. I also love the way in which you explicate at will. It's gonna be a book or an audio book, either one. But I just want to, we need to stop here. This was amazing. I want to thank Dr. Rasul Miller again for his wonderful presentation. I want to also invite you, as I'm sort of saying my thanks, for you to drop a link to Nasrul Ilm America. This is an organization that Dr. Rasul Miller is involved with, and has a chief contributing role in terms of a sort of charitable organization, in terms of thinking about remittances to some very important communities who need resources, especially as we are embarking on the coming of the holy month of Ramadan. So he's going to drop that link so that you can donate or pass the link onward to people who feel moved to do so. I want to thank our audience. I want to thank our Duke University Islamic Studies for sponsoring this and for organizing this. Let me shout out Julie real quick for the work that she does. And so I guess we're going to stop recording here. We're going to stay on for the after party and invite some of our more seasoned folks and our elders, our community members. I see my man Joe Winters in here. I think Dr. Lawrence is still with us. I see my old friend Suleiman Burnett. I see the wonderful Dr. Samir Rahman, who's probably, in order for you to do this, juggling children. Imam Abdul might still be with us, Christian Peterson, etc. Again,
let me do my official exit, and then we can have the after party. Dr. Carter, thank you very much. Thank you to both Dr. Miller, wow, and Dr. Carter for your work and your conversation today. Thanks for being here. Join us next week for our final Wednesday at the Center of the semester, titled Decolonial Ecologies to Move Beyond Exclusive Environmentalisms. Please stay with us for the after party.